7 cloaked figures dropped their disguises at the exact same second, and the heavy doors of the throne room sealed shut behind them, with a sound like a held breath finally being released. I felt the pressure change in my ears. I felt the old lock mechanisms grind into place, one after another, down the frame of the door, and I smiled. Nobody in the room noticed the smile except the Queen. My name is Ryan Cole, and 3 years ago I was a soldier on a planet nobody in this room could find on a star chart. Tonight I stood beside the throne of the Athari Empire, the only human guard the Crown had ever appointed, watching 7 trained killers spread out in a loose circle around the one person I was sworn to protect. The nobles who usually filled this room had been sent away for the night. The guards who usually stood at the outer doors had been reassigned without explanation. Only I remained, standing slightly behind and to the left of the throne, my hand resting near my side, doing absolutely nothing to stop the doors from closing. That should tell you something already. Queen Visara sat straight-backed on her throne, her long silver robe pooling around her feet, her 4-fingered hands folded calmly in her lap. She did not look afraid. She did not look surprised. If anything, she looked like a woman who had been waiting for a delivery and was pleased it had finally arrived on schedule. The Athari are not a small species. Standing, most of them tower over the average human by a full head, with pale blue skin, elongated skulls, and eyes that shift color depending on their mood. Right now, the eyes of the 7 assassins glowed a deep amber, the color their people use to signal readiness for combat. It is considered honorable among the Athari to announce your intentions before an attack. They call it the right of the open blade. No warrior worth respecting strikes from true secrecy. They reveal themselves, they name their purpose, and only then do they attack. It is, in my professional opinion, the single most useful cultural quirk I have ever been handed for free. "Guard," said the tallest of the 7, a broad-shouldered Yathari with twin blades strapped across his back. His voice carried the flat, formal tone of someone reciting words he had rehearsed. "This is not your fight. Step aside, and you will not be harmed. Our purpose is with the crown alone." I glanced sideways at the Queen. She raised one eyebrow, the closest her species comes to an amused smirk, and gave the smallest shake of her head, as if to say, "Can you believe this guy?" "That's a nice offer," I said, keeping my voice light. "But I'm going to have to decline. See, where I come from, when someone tells you to step aside right before they try to hurt someone you care about, that's usually the exact moment you don't step aside." The tall one's eyes narrowed. "Then you will share her fate." "Cool," I said. "Also not going to happen, but I appreciate the confidence." A ripple of confusion passed through the group. They had clearly expected fear, or at least the kind of tense silence their own kind would offer in this situation. Instead, they got a human who looked like he was mildly enjoying himself. One of the smaller assassins, a lean figure near the back wall, with twin curved blades and reflective goggles pushed up on her forehead, tilted her head at me the way a predator studies something that refuses to run. "You sealed the doors," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was quieter than the leader's, more curious than commanding. "We felt the locks engage. Did you think that would stop us? We came prepared for locked doors, human. We came prepared for guards, for alarms, for every defense your primitive palace still keeps from 1,000 years ago." "I know you did," I said. "That's actually the funny part." I let that sit in the air for a second, watching confusion deepen on more than one alien face. The throne room around us was ancient, even by Yathari standards, built long before their empire had expanded past its home system, back when their ancestors still worried about assassinations enough to build rooms like this one on purpose. High vaulted ceilings stretched up into shadow, thick stone pillars ringed the outer wall, each one carved with the faces of long-dead rulers. Narrow window slits let in threads of moonlight that did nothing to light the corners of the room. It was beautiful in the way old, dangerous places are beautiful, and it was, structurally speaking, exactly the kind of room I had spent 3 months quietly redesigning without anyone in the royal court noticing. Yathari nobles love to mock human security methods. I've heard it more times than I can count, always delivered with that particular tone of polite superiority certain cultures reserve for anyone they consider less advanced. Physical locks, they call them primitive. Manual overrides, they call them clumsy. Redundant fail-safes hidden behind decorative stonework, they call them, and this is a direct quote from a council member who is no longer allowed near the throne room without an escort, an amusing example of ape ingenuity. What none of them understood, because none of them had bothered to ask, was that I hadn't installed those systems to keep threats out. I had installed them to keep threats in, once they were already inside. The queen shifted slightly on her throne, drawing every eye in the room, including mine, though I kept most of my attention on the 7 figures spread around her. She raised her chin, and when she spoke, her voice filled the chamber without her needing to raise it, a skill I have never once managed to replicate despite trying. "You have gone to a great deal of trouble," she said, "to arrange this evening, disabling my outer patrols, forging authorization codes for the maintenance corridors, bribing, I assume, at least 2 members of staff who will regret their choices very soon. All of that effort, and you still have not asked yourselves the one question that matters. Don't to effort." The lean assassin with the goggles narrowed her eyes. "And what question is that, my queen?" Visara's mouth curved, just slightly, into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a warning. "Why," she said, "would I allow my human guard to lock us all in here together, if I believed for one moment that I was the one in danger?" Silence spread through the room like cold water. I watched the tall leader's amber eyes flicker, just for a second, toward the sealed door behind him, as if reconsidering it for the first time. Good. Let him reconsider. It wouldn't change anything now. I should probably explain, before this goes any further, how a human soldier from a planet most of these people had never heard of 3 years ago ended up standing guard over an alien throne that predates written human history. It started, like most things in my life recently, with a mistake other people made, and I happened to be standing nearby when it went wrong. Humanity's first real contact with a galactic power wasn't smooth. It wasn't the calm, scientific first handshake people back home like to imagine when they picture meeting aliens. It was messy, it was tense, and for about 11 days it looked like it might end very badly for a small human research outpost that had wandered further into contested space than anyone intended. A Yathari scouting vessel found us first. Diplomatic protocols were exchanged, translated, misunderstood, and eventually a boarding situation occurred that nobody on either side had planned for, and nobody on either side wanted to admit responsibility for afterward. I wasn't important during those 11 days. I was one soldier among a small security detail, doing my job, trying to keep people alive, while very tall blue diplomats and very nervous human scientists tried to figure out whether we were about to become allies or a cautionary tale. What I remember most from that week wasn't the tension or the uncertainty. It was how differently we reacted to the idea of danger compared to the Yathari officers stationed with us. Their culture, I learned quickly, is built around honor and formality even in combat. Warnings before strikes. Announced intentions. A structure to violence that frankly made it very easy to predict. Ours is not built that way. We adapt. We improvise. We use whatever is nearby, we lie about our intentions when it's useful, and we generally consider a fair fight to be a fight you have already lost the moment it starts. The Yathari officer in command of that scouting vessel watched me talk my way out of a standoff using nothing but a flashlight, a fire extinguisher, and a decision the ship's onboard translator later logged as, and I'm paraphrasing here, deeply dishonorable but extremely effective. That officer's report made its way up the chain, all the way to the royal court, all the way to a queen who had spent her entire reign surrounded by advisors who followed the same predictable rules of engagement her enemies also followed. She didn't want predictable. She wanted someone who would break every rule the moment breaking them kept her alive. 18 months later, against the loud objections of nearly her entire council, Queen Visara sent a formal request to Earth's newly established diplomatic office. She wasn't asking for a soldier, she was asking for me, specifically, by name, for a position that had never existed in Yathari royal history. Human guard to the crown. A single word describing a job nobody could quite define, because nothing like it had ever been created before. I said yes before I finished reading the second paragraph of the offer. Back in the throne room, the tall assassin took a slow step forward, twin blades still sheathed but his hand resting near their hilts. "Enough talk," he said. "Whatever games your guard has arranged, they end now." "Actually," I said, "I think this is a good time to mention one more small detail." Every amber eye in the room turned toward me. "Locking that door wasn't just about keeping you in," I said. "It also happens to seal off every emergency communication line that runs through this chamber. No outgoing signals, no way to call for backup, no way to warn whoever sent you that things aren't going according to plan. It's just us. 7 of you, 1 of her, and 1 of me." The lean assassin with the goggles let out a short, humorless laugh. "You say that as though the numbers favor you." I finally let the grin spread fully across my face, the one I'd been holding back since the doors first sealed. "They don't have to favor me," I said. "They just have to favor her. And trust me, they do." For the first time since the cloaks had dropped, I saw real uncertainty pass across more than one alien face. The queen, still perfectly composed on her throne, allowed herself the faintest sound of amusement, quiet enough that only I was close enough to hear it clearly. Somewhere behind that calm expression of hers, I knew, was the same thought running through my own head. They had planned for locked doors. They had planned for guards, for alarms, for every visible layer of defense this ancient palace still carried from 1,000 years ago. What none of them had planned for was a room built, redesigned, and quietly perfected by someone who had spent his entire life learning that the most dangerous trap is the one your enemy walks into willingly, certain the whole time that they were the ones setting it. The tall leader drew his blades at last, the amber light in his eyes deepening into something closer to red, and around the circle, 6 more weapons came free of their sheaths in near-perfect unison. I didn't reach for anything yet. I didn't need to. Not for another few seconds, anyway. "Last chance," I said, still smiling, still relaxed, still standing exactly where I wanted to be standing. "Somebody want to walk back out that door while it's still an option? No? All right then." I rolled my shoulders once, feeling the old, familiar calm settle over me the way it always did right before things got interesting. Let's see how well the right of the open blade works against someone who never agreed to follow it. The first assassin moved, and the fight for the Yathari throne finally began. The tall leader came first, which told me everything I needed to know about him. Leaders who charge first are usually leaders who have never lost. I stepped sideways instead of back, letting his first strike pass close enough to feel the air move against my sleeve, and used the motion to put one of the stone pillars between us for exactly as long as I needed. Around the room, the other 6 assassins hesitated for the length of a single heartbeat, watching their leader engage before choosing their own angles of approach. That hesitation, that small window of honor-bound patience, was worth more to me than any weapon I carried. Because in that heartbeat, I wasn't thinking about how to win a fair fight. I was thinking about how to make sure this one never became fair to begin with. I ducked around the pillar as the leader's second strike hit stone instead of flesh, sending a spray of ancient dust into the air. I used the half-second that bought me to actually look at the 6 others properly, the way I'd trained myself to look at any room full of threats. Not as one solid wall of danger, but as 7 separate puzzles, each with its own answer. The leader, the one with twin blades, moved like someone who had trained his whole life in a formal dueling hall. Big, committed strikes, strong stances, powerful but readable. He would be dangerous if I let him set the pace. I had no intention of letting him set the pace. Behind him, near the eastern pillar, stood a broad assassin with a long polearm, the kind of weapon that needs space to be effective and becomes almost useless the moment you get inside its reach. Note that, Get inside its reach. Closer to the throne, two assassins moved together, a matched pair with short blades, clearly trained to fight as a single unit rather than as individuals. Fighting pairs like that share rhythm. Break the rhythm, and you break both of them at once. Near the back wall, a smaller figure carried no visible blade at all, just a strange metal device strapped across one forearm, humming faintly with a soft blue light. That one worried me more than the rest combined. Unknown weapons are always the ones worth watching first and understanding second. And then there was the lean one with the reflective goggles, the one who had spoken with actual curiosity instead of rehearsed formality. Soren, the leader, had called her once, barking the name like a warning when she drifted slightly out of position. She moved differently from the others. Lighter, quieter. Watching me the way you watch a lock you haven't picked yet, rather than a door you're planning to kick down. 7 puzzles. 7 answers I hadn't fully worked out yet. But I had time, or at least I intended to make time, because the alternative wasn't something I was willing to consider. The leader recovered from his stone-splitting swing and turned toward me with something that might have been the Yathari equivalent of embarrassment. Missing an opponent entirely on your first strike is not considered honorable, apparently, even in a fight that had already abandoned honor the moment 7 people surrounded one queen. You dodge well, for a creature with no natural blades, he said. We make up for it in other ways, I said, circling slowly, keeping the pillar between us, and using the movement to also keep myself between the closest assassins and the throne. Mostly by not fighting fair. It's kind of our whole thing. Behind me, I heard Visara shift again on her throne, and though I couldn't see her face at that angle, I could hear the smile in her voice when she spoke. He is understating the matter, she said to no one in particular, though every assassin in the room heard her clearly. Humans do not simply fight unfairly, they redefine the terms of the fight itself, usually while the other side is still finishing their opening remarks. Soren's eyes narrowed behind her goggles. She hadn't moved from her spot near the back wall, and I was starting to suspect she wasn't planning to move first at all. She was the type who let others test the waters before she committed. Smart, dangerous, the kind of opponent you don't want to underestimate, and the kind I intended to deal with last, once everyone else in the room was distracted enough that her patience stopped being an advantage. Enough conversation, the leader said, clearly annoyed that the evening wasn't unfolding according to whatever script he'd rehearsed. He raised one blade, and the amber light in his eyes brightened. Kalen calls the formal beginning. A ripple of tension passed through the room as the other 6 shifted into ready stances, weapons raised, feet planted, every one of them waiting for their leader's signal like this was some kind of ceremony instead of an ambush. I almost laughed. I would have laughed honestly if I hadn't needed every ounce of focus I had for what came next. One thing before you call it, I said, raising a hand, and to my genuine surprise, Kalen actually paused. Old habits, deeply built into a culture, don't disappear just because the situation has changed. Even mid-ambush, some small formal part of him still expected fair notice before violence truly began. I used that pause exactly the way it deserved to be used. You asked earlier why I locked the doors, I said, loud enough for all 7 of them to hear clearly. I told you it was to trap you in here with me. That part's true, but it's not the whole answer. Kalen's jaw tightened. Then what is the whole answer, human? I glanced toward the throne, toward Queen Visera, who met my eyes with an expression that told me she already knew exactly what I was about to say, because we had planned this exact moment together, weeks ago, in a private meeting that officially never happened. The whole answer, I said, is that this room isn't just built to keep you in. It's built to record everything that happens once you're in here. Every word, every strike, every single detail of tonight, captured on systems your people don't know exist, because your people have spent generations mocking human engineering as primitive instead of actually studying it. Silence spread through the group again, faster this time, heavier. You didn't come here to eliminate a queen tonight, I continued. You came here to walk straight into evidence. Whoever sent you 7 is about to become very easy to identify and very easy to punish the moment this is over. For the first time, real doubt crossed more than one face in that circle. Kalen's amber eyes flickered, and beside him, one of the paired short-blade fighters shifted his weight uneasily, glancing toward the sealed door as if reconsidering the wisdom of walking through it in the first place. Only Soren didn't react at all. She simply watched me with the same careful, curious patience as before, as though my little speech had told her something useful rather than something frightening. "A clever bluff," she said quietly, "or a clever truth. Either way, it changes nothing. We were sent here to complete a task. We will complete it, recorded or not." Kalen straightened, seeming to draw confidence from her words, and lowered his raised blade back into a ready position. "She speaks correctly," he said. "Whatever games you play, human, our purpose remains. The Queen dies tonight, and our employer will deal with whatever evidence your primitive systems have gathered." I let out a slow breath, feeling the last traces of hesitation drain out of my chest, replaced by the calm, steady focus that had gotten me through worse rooms than this one. "All right then," I said, rolling my shoulders once. I did try the easy way. Behind me, the Queen's voice carried through the chamber one final time before the true fighting began, calm, amused, and utterly certain of the outcome. "Ryan," she said, using my name for the first time that entire evening instead of the formal title she usually favored in front of others. "Do try not to damage the northern pillar again. The stonemasons complained for months after the last incident." "No promises," I said, and meant it. Kalen's patience finally broke. He gave a short, sharp signal with his free hand, and the formal ceremony of the rite of the open blade dissolved into something far less structured. 7 trained killers moved at once, converging from 7 different angles, weapons raised, amber eyes burning bright with the particular focus of people who genuinely believed they were about to win. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for everything that happened next. I never once doubted that they were wrong, not because I underestimated them. Every one of those 7 had spent years, possibly decades, mastering forms of combat that would have ended most people in this galaxy within seconds. I respected that. I respected it enough to have spent the last 3 months preparing very specifically for the moment their patience finally ran out. The polearm user near the eastern pillar moved first among the group, exactly as I'd predicted, closing the distance in a wide, sweeping arc meant to force me back into open ground where his reach advantage would matter most. I did not give him open ground. I went the opposite direction entirely, straight toward him, closing the distance faster than his weapon was built to handle at close range, and used the narrow gap between 2 support pillars to slip past his guard entirely before his weapon had finished its first swing. Behind me, I heard the polearm crack hard against solid stone instead of me, and I heard him grunt in frustration as the impact shivered up through the shaft into his hands. I didn't stop moving. Stopping was the one thing I couldn't afford in a room full of 7, because standing still, even for a second, meant giving all of them a fixed target at the same time. Movement was the only real advantage a single human had against 7 trained warriors, and I intended to use every inch of that advantage the ancient architects had unknowingly built into this room for exactly this kind of desperate, uneven fight. The paired short-blade fighters came next, moving together with the fluid, practiced rhythm of partners who had trained side by side for years, each one covering the gaps the other left open. Against most opponents, that kind of coordination would be nearly impossible to break. Against me, it created a very specific, very exploitable weakness, because coordinated pairs rely completely on each other's positioning staying predictable. I broke their rhythm, the only way that actually works against training that deep. I refused to be where either of them expected. Instead of retreating from their advance, the move any sane opponent would make, I stepped directly between them, close enough that neither could safely swing a blade without risking hitting their own partner. For one full second, both of them hesitated, caught in the exact kind of confusion their training had never prepared them for, and 1 full second was more than enough time for me to put both of them on the ground without either blade ever touching me. Across the room, Kalen's roar of frustration told me he'd seen the whole exchange, and that his patience, already thin, had finally run out completely. "Enough," he bellowed, abandoning whatever remained of formal dueling structure entirely. "All of you, together, now." And that, more than anything else that had happened so far, was exactly the mistake I had been hoping he would eventually make. There's a lesson they teach early in human close-quarters training, one I learned long before I ever set foot on a Yathari ship or stood in a Yathari palace. It's simple, almost embarrassingly so, and it's the exact opposite of everything most honor-based warrior cultures believe about combat. The lesson is this: when someone tells you to fight fair, they are usually the one who benefits from fairness. Refuse the invitation. My old instructor back on Earth, a quiet, no-nonsense woman who had survived 3 separate deployments most people never talk about, used to say it a different way every single session, just so it never stopped sounding fresh. "Fights are not contests," she'd say. "Contests have rules because both sides agreed to the same risk. Fights happen because someone decided your risk didn't matter to them. So stop pretending you owe them a fair chance to finish what they started." I thought about her voice for exactly half a second as 5 remaining assassins converged on my position at once, because 5 people moving together, even skilled ones, create predictable patterns the moment they try to coordinate around a single target. Predictable patterns are gifts. I intended to use every one of them. The one with the strange metal device on his forearm activated it for the first time, and the soft blue humming sound sharpened into something closer to a whine. A narrow beam of pale light lanced out toward me, moving faster than anything Kalen's blades had managed, and I only avoided it because I'd already started moving the instant the humming changed pitch. The beam struck the stone floor where I'd been standing and left a scorched, smoking line across the ancient tile. Not a blade. Some kind of directed energy weapon then, small enough to be portable, powerful enough to leave a mark like that on solid stone. I filed that information away and kept moving, because stopping to admire a weapon that had almost taken my head off was not a habit that kept people alive very long. I used the confusion of 5 bodies converging at once, angled myself so that the device user's next shot would have to pass dangerously close to Kalen's shoulder if he wanted a clear line on me, and watched with grim satisfaction as the device user hesitated, unwilling to risk hitting his own leader. That hesitation bought me the half-second I needed to close distance on him directly, inside the effective range where his weapon needed space to charge between shots, and end his participation in the fight before he found the nerve to fire again regardless of the risk. 4 remained. Kalen came at me directly this time. No more formal announcements, no more rehearsed lines, just pure focused aggression from someone who had finally accepted that this fight would not follow any rules he recognized. His twin blades moved fast, faster than his earlier strikes had suggested he was capable of, and for the first time that evening, I felt something close to genuine concern settle into my chest. Concern is useful, fear is not. I have spent a long time learning the difference. I let him press the advantage for exactly as long as it took to understand his rhythm, the small telltale shift in his shoulders before each strike, the way his weight favored his back leg whenever he prepared a heavier blow. Once I had that rhythm mapped, I stopped simply avoiding him and started using his own momentum against him, redirecting one heavy strike just enough that it carried him half a step past where he intended, opening a gap along his side that his formal training had never once considered vulnerable, because no honorable opponent would ever exploit a stumble mid-duel. I am not, technically speaking, an honorable opponent by Yathari standards. I have made my peace with that distinction a long time ago. Kalen went down hard, blades clattering against ancient stone, and for a moment, the entire throne room seemed to hold its breath along with him. 3 remained. The polearm fighter, still nursing a bruised grip from his earlier missed strike. One of the paired short blade fighters, separated now from his partner and clearly rattled by it. and Soren, who still had not moved from her position near the back wall, watching everything unfold with the same careful, patient curiosity she'd shown from the very beginning. The polearm fighter recovered his composure and came at me with wide, sweeping strikes meant to keep me at a distance his weapon favored. I let him chase me toward the eastern pillar, exactly the spot where his earlier miss had already cracked the stone, and when his next swing came, I didn't dodge it entirely. I let the shaft strike the weakened stone instead of open air, and this time the crack became a full fracture, sending a chunk of ancient masonry down onto the weapon itself, wedging it uselessly against the broken pillar. He wasted 2 full seconds trying to free it. 2 seconds was more than enough. 2 remained. The remaining short-blade fighter, without his partner's rhythm to rely on, fought with the kind of desperate unpredictability that comes from training that has never once accounted for being alone. Desperate and unpredictable sounds dangerous, and in some ways it is, but it also means abandoning the very structure his years of training had built. I closed the distance before he found new footing, and the fight ended for him the same way it had ended for the others before him. Quickly, decisively, without the kind of drawn-out struggle his training had never prepared him to survive on his own. 1 remained. Soren finally moved. She crossed the distance between us with a speed that made every previous assassin look slow by comparison. Twin curved blades flashing under the thin moonlight from the narrow window slits above. I barely got my forearm up in time to deflect the first strike, and even deflected, it carried enough force to send a jolt of pain up through my shoulder that told me, very clearly, that I had been saving the most dangerous opponent for last without fully appreciating just how dangerous she actually was. "You fought well," she said, blade still moving, still probing for an opening my defense hadn't yet shown her. "Better than any report suggested, but cleverness has limits, human. Eventually it runs out of tricks." "Maybe," I said, backing a step, feeling the edge of the throne's raised platform beneath my heel. "But I've got one more, if you're interested." She didn't answer with words. She answered with a strike aimed low and fast, meant to end things before I found whatever trick I was talking about, and for 1 terrible second, I genuinely believed I wasn't going to get my arm up in time. That's when everything changed, faster than I could process it in the moment, and slower than I've replayed it in my memory every single night since. Because in that same second, across the width of the throne room, one of the fallen assassins, the device user I'd taken down earlier, wasn't actually as finished as I had assumed. His forearm weapon, damaged but not destroyed, hummed back to life one final time, and the beam it released wasn't aimed at me at all. It was aimed directly at the throne. Directly at Queen Visara, who had remained composed and unmoving through the entire fight, trusting completely in a plan we had built together weeks ago, never once expecting the plan to include a wounded assassin finding one last desperate shot at the one target that actually mattered to whoever had sent them here. I didn't think. There wasn't time to think, and thinking has never once been the thing that kept me alive in moments like that one. I moved. I threw myself sideways, across the space between the throne and the failing beam of light, and for one single suspended heartbeat, everything in that ancient room went completely, perfectly silent. The beam struck me square in the chest, and I went down hard against the stone steps of the throne, the impact knocking every ounce of breath from my lungs. Soren froze mid-strike, staring at me with something I hadn't expected to see on her face at all. Not satisfaction, not victory. Something closer to confusion, as though the sight of me on the ground had broken some expectation she hadn't realized she was carrying. Kalen, still recovering on the floor nearby, lifted his head just enough to watch. The device user, his weapon finally spent completely, slumped back against the wall, whatever strength had powered that last desperate shot now fully drained from him. For a long moment, nobody in that room moved at all. Then I sat up. I want to be honest about how satisfying that moment was, because I had been waiting 3 months for exactly that reaction on exactly that face, and it did not disappoint. Soren's confusion deepened into something close to disbelief as she watched me climb back to my feet, one hand pressed against my chest, not in pain, but simply checking that the reinforced plating hidden beneath my uniform had done its job the way it was designed to. "Sorry," I said, straightening up fully, rolling my shoulder to work the ache back out of it. "Should have mentioned that part earlier too. Human uniforms are a lot less primitive than your council likes to pretend." The vest beneath my clothes wasn't standard palace equipment. It wasn't Yathari technology at all. It was human engineering, quietly smuggled in through diplomatic supply channels over the past several months, designed specifically to absorb exactly the kind of directed energy weapon I'd suspected someone in this ambush might eventually try to use, because that particular model of forearm device wasn't unfamiliar to me at all. I'd seen intelligence reports about it before. I'd specifically requested protection against it before I ever agreed to let this whole evening play out the way it had. Soren lowered her blade slowly, staring at me, then at the throne, then back at me again, as pieces of a much larger picture began visibly assembling themselves behind her eyes. "This was never simply about surviving an ambush," she said quietly. "You planned for this, all of it, from the very beginning." "Not all of it," I admitted. "The beam aimed at the Queen instead of me. That part genuinely worried me for about half a second. But everything else? Yeah, all of it." Queen Visara rose from her throne for the first time that entire evening, unhurried, composed, her long silver robe settling around her as she stepped down onto the same stone platform where I'd just been lying moments earlier. She looked out over the scattered, defeated assassins with an expression that held no anger at all, only a kind of tired, patient satisfaction, the look of someone who had finally confirmed a suspicion she had been carrying for a very long time. "You wonder why my human guard locked us in together," she said, addressing Soren directly, though her words clearly reached everyone still conscious in the room. "You assumed it was simply to trap you here. It was, but it was also to trap something else entirely, something none of you were meant to know you were carrying into this room with you." She gestured, and I reached into a hidden pocket along my belt, retrieving a small, unremarkable device no larger than a coin, one I had personally placed weeks ago inside the ceremonial cloak provided to each of the 7 assassins before tonight ever began. A cloak, I should mention, that had been supplied not by the palace's official quartermaster, but by a very specific member of the Queen's own council, one who believed he was arranging a private, untraceable delivery to 7 hired killers he had personally recruited. "Every one of you," Visara said, "has been broadcasting your location, your conversation, and every detail of this evening's plan since the moment you accepted those cloaks, including the name of the person who commissioned them for you." Soren's expression shifted again, faster this time, moving through surprise into something colder and more focused. She turned her head slightly toward Kalen, still lying on the ground nearby, and I watched a silent, unspoken accusation pass between them, the kind that only happens between people who have just realized they were never actually working for who they thought they were. "Counselor Threx," Visara said, and the name landed in that ancient room like a physical weight. "A man who has sat on my council for 11 years, a man who publicly objected, quite loudly, to my decision to appoint a human guard, on the grounds that it was beneath the dignity of this throne. I always found that particular objection curious, given how quietly he continued visiting my private chambers afterward, offering his continued loyalty in one breath, and, apparently, arranging my removal in the next." Soren lowered her blades completely now, letting them fall from her hands onto the stone floor with a sound that echoed through the silent chamber. Whatever loyalty she had carried into this room, it had clearly never extended to being used as evidence against herself by someone she'd never even met. "We were told," she said slowly, "that we served the true interests of the Empire, that the crown had grown weak, dependent on outside creatures instead of its own people." "And you believed him," I said, not unkindly, "because he made it sound honorable, because your whole culture is built around trusting people who present things formally, with proper ceremony, with the right words in the right order. That's not a flaw in you. That's just something Threx understood how to exploit." I glanced toward Kalen, who had managed to sit up fully now, watching the exchange with the exhausted, hollowed-out expression of a man realizing his entire mission had been built on a lie from the very first briefing. "For what it's worth," I added, "you all fought well, genuinely. If I hadn't spent 3 months preparing specifically for this exact scenario, I'm honestly not sure how tonight ends. That's not something I say lightly." Vesera stepped closer to Soren, studying her with the same careful, patient attention she'd shown the whole evening, and after a long moment, she spoke again, her tone shifting from formal accusation into something quieter, more deliberate. "You have a choice in front of you," she said. "Threx sent 7 of you here expecting a queen's death and his own promotion to follow shortly after. Instead, he has given me 7 witnesses, 1 recording device carrying his own voice giving orders, and 1 very clear demonstration of exactly how little he valued the lives of the people he claimed to be recruiting for a noble cause." Soren said nothing, but she didn't look away either. "Testify against him," Vesara continued, "and I will consider the circumstances of tonight very differently than the law technically allows me to. Continue protecting him out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to a man who has already proven he would have let every one of you die here tonight without a second thought, and I will have no choice but to treat you exactly as harshly as tradition demands." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I found myself genuinely uncertain which way it would break. Then Soren knelt, slowly, formally, in a gesture I recognized even without understanding its full cultural weight, and inclined her head toward the throne. "I will speak everything I know," she said. "All of it." Behind her, one by one, the other surviving assassins did the same. I looked over at Vesara, and for just a moment, the formal mask of Queen slipped just enough to let something more personal through, something tired and relieved and, I like to think, more than a little proud of how the evening had actually unfolded compared to how it could have gone. "Well," I said quietly, just to her, "that went about as well as I could have hoped, honestly." "It went," she said, "exactly as well as you planned, Ryan Cole. Do not pretend modesty with me. I have read your after-action reports. You are terrible at it." I laughed, the tension of the last several minutes finally draining out of my shoulders all at once, and for the first time since those 7 cloaks had dropped, the throne room felt, briefly, like an ordinary room again instead of a battlefield. It wouldn't stay that way for long. Rooms like this one rarely do, but for just a moment, standing there among defeated assassins and a queen who trusted me more than her own council ever had, it felt exactly like enough. The doors unsealed 20 minutes later, once the recorded evidence had finished uploading to a secure line only Vesara and I knew existed, and the palace guard finally flooded into the throne room with the kind of urgent, apologetic energy of soldiers who had just realized they'd missed the most important night of their careers by standing outside a locked door the entire time. I let them handle the practical details, restraining the surviving assassins, though gently, since none of them had resisted once Vesera made her offer clear, sending word to the medical wing for the 2 who needed attention after our fight, sealing off the corridors leading to Counselor Threx's private chambers before word of tonight's failure could possibly reach him first. That last part mattered most, and it happened faster than I expected. By the time the first pale light of morning touched the tall windows of the palace's eastern wing, Threx was already in custody, dragged from his bed still in his sleeping robes, sputtering formal protests about diplomatic privilege that grew noticeably quieter once he was shown the recording taken from inside those 7 cloaks. I wasn't there for that particular conversation. Vesara handled it personally, and from what little she told me afterward, it was considerably less dramatic than 11 years of buildup might have suggested. Threx did not go down fighting. He did not offer some grand, defiant speech about his vision for the Empire's future. He simply stopped talking entirely, the moment he understood there was nothing left worth saying that wouldn't make his situation worse. Some villains are like that, I've found. all confidence in ceremony right up until the exact moment reality catches up with them, and then there's nothing left underneath but a man who miscalculated badly and is only now beginning to understand the size of that mistake. The council session that followed, 3 days later, was the kind of event I generally try to avoid whenever possible. Long speeches, careful diplomatic language, a room full of Yathari nobles who had spent years quietly questioning whether a human guard belonged anywhere near their throne, now forced to sit through a formal accounting of exactly how close their own council had come to losing that throne entirely, and exactly whose planning had stopped it. I stood at my usual place beside the throne, trying my best not to look as uncomfortable as I felt, while half the room stared at me like they were seeing me clearly for the first time. Vesara handled the formal proceedings with the same composed authority she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal, laying out the evidence methodically, allowing Soren and the others to give their testimony without interruption, and only once, near the very end of the session, did she allow herself a pointed remark clearly aimed at the empty seat where Threx would have once sat. "There were those among you," she said, letting her gaze sweep slowly across the assembled council, "who questioned my judgment when I appointed a human guard to this crown. Some called it beneath our dignity. Others called it, and I believe this was the exact phrase used, an amusing example of ape ingenuity." A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the room. I caught sight of at least 2 council members suddenly finding something fascinating to study on the floor in front of them. "I would ask those individuals," Vesara continued, "to reflect on what actually happened 3 nights ago in this very room. 7 trained assassins, sent by one of our own, failed entirely against a single human, not because he possessed greater strength, or more advanced weapons, or superior numbers. He succeeded because he thought differently than we do, in ways our own traditions never taught us to anticipate, and because I trusted that difference enough to build an entire strategy around it." She paused, letting the weight of that settle fully before finishing. "I do not intend to apologize for that trust again. Not to this council, not to anyone. If any among you still believe humanity's methods are beneath this empire's dignity, I invite you to explain that position to Councillor Threx, once he finishes explaining his own choices to the tribunal handling his case." Nobody took her up on that particular invitation. The weeks that followed brought changes I hadn't fully expected, though I probably should have. Word travels fast in a royal court, faster still across an empire that spans more star systems than I can comfortably picture in my head, and the story of what happened in that throne room didn't stay contained to palace gossip for very long. By the time a full month had passed, I started noticing something subtle but unmistakable in how other species representatives spoke to me during official functions. Less condescension, more careful, measured curiosity, the kind reserved for something you've recently learned to take seriously. A Velkari trade envoy, visiting the palace for unrelated negotiations, cornered me during a formal dinner one evening and asked, with what I can only describe as genuine scientific curiosity, whether all humans were trained to think the way I apparently had that night, or whether I was simply an unusual example of my species. I told her the honest answer, which is that most humans aren't soldiers at all, and most soldiers aren't guards to alien royalty, but that the underlying instinct, the refusal to accept a fair fight when an unfair one keeps more people alive, that part runs pretty deep across most of us. She seemed genuinely troubled by that answer in a way I found more flattering than any compliment could have been. Even Kalen, recovering under guard while the tribunal determined the full extent of leniency his cooperation had earned him, requested a private conversation with me before his case concluded. I almost said no. Old instincts, mostly, the kind that don't fully trust a request like that even after everything that had already happened, but something in how he'd asked, formally, through official channels, without any of the theatrical menace he'd carried into that throne room, convinced me to hear him out. He didn't apologize, exactly. Yathari culture doesn't really have an equivalent gesture for that, not in the way humans mean it. Instead, he asked me a question that had clearly been sitting with him since the night of the fight, turning over and over in his mind during the long, quiet hours of confinement. "You could have ended things more permanently," he said. "Several times during our fight, you had openings that would have finished me completely. You chose not to take them. I have spent considerable time trying to understand why, and I find myself unable to reach a satisfying conclusion on my own." I thought about that question longer than I expected to, mostly because I hadn't consciously articulated the answer to myself yet either, not in so many words. "Because you were following orders you believed were honorable," I said eventually. "Misguided ones, sure. Ones built on a lie somebody else constructed specifically to use people like you. But you genuinely thought you were protecting your empire from a threat, not attacking an innocent queen out of greed or cruelty. That matters to me, even if it wouldn't have mattered enough to stop me if you'd actually succeeded in hurting her." Kalen considered that for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the particular way Yathari faces often are to someone who hasn't spent years learning to read them properly. "Your kind possesses a strange kind of mercy," he said finally. "Ruthless in the moment, careful in its aftermath. I do not fully understand it, but I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I respect it." "Yeah," I said, standing to leave. "I get that a lot. The quiet moment I remember most clearly from those weeks, though, didn't happen in any formal council session or tense confrontation. It happened late one evening, well after the palace had gone mostly silent, when I found Viscera alone in the throne room, standing near the same eastern pillar Kalen's polearm had cracked during our fight, running one careful finger along the fracture line as if she could somehow smooth it back into place through touch alone. "They'll repair that properly next week," I said, walking up beside her. "Sorry about the damage, by the way. I did warn you." "You did," she agreed, not looking away from the crack. "I find myself oddly fond of it, actually. It seems appropriate, somehow, that this room should carry a permanent reminder of the night it stopped being merely decorative and became useful again for the first time in generations." I leaned against the pillar beside her, feeling the cool stone through my shoulder, and for a while neither of us said anything at all, comfortable in the kind of silence that only happens between people who have already survived something significant together. "Can I ask you something?" I said eventually. "Honestly, not for any official report or anything." "You may. Weren't you scared? Even a little? 7 assassins in a locked room, and you just sat there the whole time like it was a mildly interesting afternoon." Vesera finally turned to look at me directly, and something in her expression softened in a way I rarely saw during formal hours, something closer to the private, unguarded person underneath all the ceremony and authority her position required of her constantly. "I was terrified," she said simply. "Every second of it. I simply trusted the plan we built together more than I trusted my own fear, and I have found, over a long life, that trust is generally the better guide of the two, even when it costs something to maintain." "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you were scared, but you're too dignified to show it." "Yes," she said, and for the first time I heard something close to genuine warmth in her voice instead of formal amusement. "That is precisely what I am saying." We stood there a while longer, watching moonlight shift slowly across the ancient stone floor, through the narrow window slits above, the same floor where 7 assassins had stood ready to end everything just weeks earlier, now empty and quiet and, for the moment at least, entirely safe. "For what it's worth," I said eventually, "I wasn't exactly calm either. I just had a better poker face than you gave me credit for." "I am aware," Vesera said. "I have read your medical records from that evening. Your pulse tells a very different story than your smile did." I laughed, and she allowed herself something close to a genuine smile in return, brief but real, the kind that never quite made it into official portraits or formal court appearances, reserved for moments exactly like this one. Eventually she turned to leave, pausing only once at the threshold of the throne room, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Ryan," she said, "thank you, not simply for tonight, for trusting a plan built around exposing danger rather than avoiding it entirely. Not many advisors would have recommended such a course, human or otherwise." Most advisors aren't trying to protect someone they actually respect, I said. They're trying to protect a title. That's a pretty big difference, in my experience. She held my gaze a moment longer, then inclined her head slightly, the smallest gesture of genuine respect I'd seen from her since the night we first met, and left me alone in the quiet throne room. I stayed a while longer after she'd gone, walking the familiar perimeter of the chamber out of habit more than necessity, checking the same locks and hidden mechanisms I'd spent 3 months perfecting, making sure everything remained exactly as reliable as it needed to be for whatever came next. When I reached the main doors, I paused, resting my hand against the cool metal frame, thinking back to that first night, the sound of 7 cloaks dropping at once, the confident certainty on 7 faces that had believed, right up until the very end, that they held every advantage in that room. I sealed the locks anyway, out of pure habit more than any real threat waiting outside tonight, listening to that same familiar sound of old mechanisms clicking into place one by one down the length of the frame. And I found myself smiling again, quiet and satisfied in the empty room, because I already knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes from experience, that whatever came through those doors next time, whoever eventually tested this palace's defenses again, they were not going to find the same primitive, mockable security their predecessors had once laughed about so confidently. Next time, it wouldn't be an ambush they were walking into. It would be an invitation, and I intended to make absolutely sure they regretted accepting it.